Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture deals with the branch of biology known as systematics, which includes the construction of evolutionary trees. To begin, we'll first look at what is systematics. And of course, systematics clearly must be related to evolution, and so we're going to look at how we use systematics to first evaluate character states, which is a critical part in the construction of evolutionary trees. And evolutionary trees basically say how do different organisms relate to each other. These principles will be explored as part of phylogenetics, which will be our last part of this lecture. To get started, let's first talk about what is systematics. Systematics is basically the branch of biology that wants to know if I take a group of species, how are they related to each other? So if I have species A, species B, and species C, what I really want to know is, are A and B related to each other but not really to C, or are B and C related to each other but not A? How are they related? That's essentially the question that a systematics hypothesis would address. So for example, if I were to give you a human, a dog, and a flower, you would probably be able to tell me that the human and the dog are more closely related to each other than either are to the flower. So that's what systematics is. Systematics is actually broken up into two subcategories. One is phylogenetics. Phylogenetics is going to be the branch of biology that basically says, okay, how do I think these organisms are related? This is what's known as an evolutionary hypothesis, or the creation of an evolutionary tree. Now, interestingly, unlike most hypotheses, which use a written form, phylogenetics use a graphical form, and we call that a phylogenetic tree. But we'll look at that in a little bit. The other branch of systematics is called taxonomy. And taxonomy basically says, let's take these organisms and classify them into smaller and smaller compartments until finally we have a single species. Once we have that species, we'll assign a scientific name. We're going to begin our conversation with the study of taxonomy. The word taxonomy has its root in the word taxon. A taxon is going to be a group of evolutionarily related species or organisms. I want you to imagine that you're going to walk into a grocery store, but the grocery store hasn't been set up yet. Instead, what we have is just a whole bunch of food items all over a big warehouse. It's going to be your job to organize the food according to taxonomic principles, which basically says that you'll group like food types together. And of course, this isn't far off from how a real grocery store is organized. If you take an orange, you're probably not going to place your oranges next to your wine or your bread. Instead, you're going to place your oranges with other like types like lemons and limes, or the citruses. And of course, the citruses will be with the other fruits, and the fruits will be with the produce, and so on. In the same way, we can take all the organisms on the planet, of which there are millions actually of different species, and we can start breaking them down into smaller and smaller and smaller groups. So for example, we'll take all the organisms or all the species on the planet and we'll break them down into 6 different groups. Those are called our kingdoms. So we have animals, plants, fungi, bacteria. Those are all separated into different kingdoms. And within a kingdom, we break it down into an even smaller group. For example, the animals are broken down by chordates, which include the vertebrates, and then some of the invertebrates as well, and so on. A cute way to remember the actual organizational hierarchy of taxonomy as kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species, and during each level you get a smaller and smaller subset of what you started with, is by this little ditty. Kings play chess on fine-grained sand. And if you say that, you'll get the acronym KPCOFGS. And of course, that represents kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Okay, now that we've explored taxonomy, let's go ahead and take a look at the idea of naming a species. If you look here, you'll notice there are 3 marine mammals, and you might even recognize them as a killer whale, a sea otter, and a California sea lion, respectively. Those would be their common names, but they also go by their scientific names. Their scientific names, or the scientific nomenclature, is going to be their genus and species name put together. So a killer whale becomes Orcinus orca. A sea otter becomes Enhydra lutris, and a California sea lion becomes Xolophus californianus. Now, when you write these out, these scientific names, remember that the genus name is going to be capitalized while the species name is going to be lowercase. And also, always remember to write out scientific names in italics, and that tells you you're dealing with a scientific name. Let's go ahead and take a look at the taxonomy of some of the marine mammals. So we've already covered the basics of the marine mammals, but if you think about all the marine mammals that we've covered so far, let's see if we can place their taxonomic position. Of course, we know that all marine mammals are going to be animals, so they all belong to the kingdom Animalia. And in fact, they all belong to the phylum Chordata. Now, the phylum Chordata has many classes in it, including an aves class, which is birds. We have a couple fish classes in there, and of course, then we have the class Mammalia, which is where they belong because they are indeed marine mammals. But once we get into that class, it turns out that the marine mammals actually get divided up into 3 different orders. We have order Carnivora, order Cetacea, and order Sirenia. So how do you think the different marine mammals play out in there? Well, carnivora, of course, stands for carnivores. So you might think, okay, some of the marine mammals that are more carnivore-like are going to be in there, and you're right, and that includes the polar bears, but it also includes the pinnipeds. And remember, the pinnipeds are going to be the seals and the sea lions and the fur seals. Then we get over to the Cetacea, and the Cetacea sounds a whole lot like cetaceans, and of course you're right, those are going to be the whales and the dolphins. And then finally we get into Sirenia, which include the Sirenians, which we now know to be the manatees and the dugongs. So there, of course, is going to be how those marine mammals get organized. Now that we've finished looking at taxonomy, let's move over to the really interesting stuff, which is phylogenetics. Phylogenetics is going to be the branch that basically says, how are these species related to each other? And what evidence can we provide to support that particular hypothesis? Now notice I used a very key word, hypothesis. Phylogenetics is not fact, and that's because we haven't been around long enough to actually view evolution, which happens over millions of years. So we have to basically try to take the clues in front of us and piece it back together to use our best judgment to say, how are these organisms related? And the example that I gave you earlier between the human, the dog, and the flower, those are kind of obvious, where you say, well, the dog and the human, you know, they're both mammals, they're both warm-blooded, we both have hair, the flower isn't even an animal. But once you get a group of organisms that are more closely related, it becomes actually a little less obvious and a little more difficult. So let's move there and take a look at what are some of the techniques we can use to create an evolutionary hypothesis. All right, the first thing that I want to stress is that when we create one of these, they are a hypothesis. It's our best guess of how organisms are going to be related based on the available data. We call the product a phylogeny, which is basically a fancy way of saying an evolutionary relationship or an evolutionary map. Now, I actually have a couple phylogenies here, and you might be surprised that my hypotheses are not written, but they are graphical. They're essentially a graphical representation of how we think organisms are related to each other. We call these trees because in some sense they do resemble a tree where you start with a trunk and then you go off into numerous branches. If you take a look at the phylogeny that's actually here on the left, you might actually notice up here that we have a couple of the organisms that I talked about, including the human. Now, if you look here, we have a human, a bird, a mouse, and a rat. How does that tree represent what we think is the evolutionary relationship between those 4 organisms? Well, we know that humans, rats, and mice, of course, are all mammals, and birds are not. So when we take a look at this, we say, okay, the humans, the rats, and the mice should be grouped together and away from the birds. That's represented right here with that branching pattern, where we see one trunk and then 3 different branches. But then even among that, we notice that the mice and the rats go more closely together than they do to the humans, which are branched off a little bit to the side. That also reflects our hypothesis that mice and rats are going to be more closely related, clearly they're both rodents, than either of them are to the humans. In the other picture with the birds, we represent the fact that phylogenies are indeed just hypotheses. They're not really fact, in that you use the best available data to create what you think is probably the best representation. And of course, phylogenies are always subject to change. As we get new data and we add new data to our data set, we're going to probably come up with new conclusions. So what type of evidence would you use for a phylogenetic analysis? Well, traditionally, we used morphological data. Morphological data is probably best exemplified by using skeletal structures. Phylogenists like to use skeletal structures in part because then there's a very nice correlation with the fossil record. Indeed, you might have had a parent population evolve into different species, but the parent population is long since either evolved or extinct, and so you can't really see that by looking at those two species, but if you have the fossilized remains of the parent species, suddenly you can start tracing the skeletal changes. So morphological data has been used for many, many years. Starting about the 1990s, molecular data made a huge splash on the scene of phylogenetic analysis, and in particular, DNA sequences. So now, probably the most robust data sets actually use a combination of morphological data and molecular data as well. All right, once you actually have your data sets, let's distinguish between a character and a character state. A character is going to be a hereditary attribute of an organism, and a character state is going to be a variation of that character. So let's use some examples to show how these terms actually differ. On the morphological side, assume that I'm looking at blubber layer, which is something we'd actually really look at for marine mammals. We would call the character the blubber layer, where the character state is going to be the thickness. So for example, I might have thin, medium, or very, very thick. In converse, let's take a look at molecular data. For molecular data, we would basically take a look at a specific gene and the DNA sequence there within, and we would say the character is going to be a particular position, such as the first position in a gene. The character state are going to be your options, and of course we have A, C, G, and T. And so in this example, we see the two DNA sequences actually differ at their very first position, so those are two different character states. Once you've identified what characters you want to use and the character states for the different organisms, then you're going to create what is called a character matrix. And we have a character matrix here on the left for a variety of chordates. And then from there, we're going to actually construct our phylogenetic tree, which in this class is going to be called a cladogram. So again, where we're moving is we're going to create a character matrix, and then we're going to go ahead and use that or apply that to actually construct our own evolutionary hypothesis. How this is done will be saved for the next part of this lecture.